We're discussing essentially the roots of the debate over communion in both kinds, which has become a lively question again under conditions of lockdown with churches closed, and when they are open, public health advice has been that the Eucharist should be administered only in one kind, bread only. Now, in many cases, this has not perhaps had a great impact on Catholic parish church practice, but it has had an undeniable impact on Anglicans, and I think also in the Orthodox communion, James, if I follow the discussions we've had. The Church of Ireland bishops spent some time last year drawing up guidelines and eventually came to the conclusion that what they drew the line at referring explicitly to little cups. They referred to as individual vessels, but those became permissible. But in a sense, all of that is now an academic question because we're once more locked out of the churches until further notice. Anyway, this seemed like a very good opportunity once the conversation about the kinds of questions that were arising had begun to involve some experts in exploring some of its historical roots. And so this evening I'm delighted that we have George Woodman, who is a church historian and a retired librarian, and Professor Tom O'Loughlin. George has an MA in Church History from Nottingham University and a first degree in Classics from Trinity College Dublin. He also belongs to the Church of Ireland General Synod. Tom, who is well known to you, is Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology in the University of Nottingham. He's also, very much to our advantage, written a great deal on the role of the cup in early Christian history. And he has made available an article on the question of the cup in the Gospel of Luke. So if you're interested, do signal that and we can make that available on the Living Liturgy Forum website. So without further ado, can I hand over to you, George and Tom?
Thank you, Bridget.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks, Bridget.
George, could I take this opportunity to point out that if you were a Christian in Western Europe in 1500, you would never have seen anyone drink the cup because the priest would have drunk it with his back to you, and you might have seen the cup, but you would never have seen drinking. And then one of the great insights of the Reformers, echoing the great work of Jan Hus, who was murdered in 1415 or martyred in 1415, but he was done away with for what he was saying. The Reformers decided that drinking the cup was a key part of Christian Eucharistic practice. Now, I know that you know far more than probably anyone else who's taking part in this debate tonight, when that insight started to become actual practice among Christians in Britain and Ireland.
Well, I first of all, just to say that the level of my expertise is not so very great, but yes, when it actually started in Britain and Ireland was actually all quite sudden. To give a very brief sort of introduction on the whole history of the way in which the somewhat haphazard way the Reformation developed in England, when in 1533 Henry VIII basically got rid of the Pope. But what you had then was a sort of rather curious, was almost Catholicism without the Pope. Not very much changed, and there was a sort of ferment between conservative forces who were largely quite happy with a separate English church, but basically a Catholic one, and more and radical voices looking for a Reformation. But in terms of sort of receiving but in terms of the actual celebration of Mass, nothing really changed for quite a few years until Henry VIII died in 1547. Then the accession of Edward VI was more or less released the floodgates. It also, interestingly, brought Europeans into reformed theologians into England, who came along to advise and brought things in a somewhat more radical, drew things in a somewhat more radical direction, notably the figure of Martin Bucer. And one of the things that concerned them was that the cup, there had been no move towards making the cup towards communion with both kinds among the laity, which had already become the sort of a rallying point, certainly for Lutherans, and then later as the Swiss Reform developed. The first change, so from 1547 there was gradually a change in the a move towards services in English, and in fact the change. Common cup was probably the first sign of Reformation that the mass of people would have seen in the Mass. The first liturgical text was what was called the Order of the Communion. It was actually an insertion into the Mass which took place after with bringing in prayers, which subsequently became standard for the Book of Common Prayer. This was published early in 1548 to be introduced on Easter Day, 1548. And if I could possibly have I have a slide from it, so if I could possibly see have my first slide, please. Thanks, James. Yes. Well, as you can see, what happened was that picturing the congregation in 1548, and indeed the clergy in that would also need to be, in fact, one reason why it took them a bit of time to introduce was the clergy had to be sort of more or less trained or possibly bullied into actually using this. And of course, they chose Easter as well as the time when everybody would receive the sacrament. And so what happened was that the priest would turn and to the people, and we were given this very detailed, and they had to be given this very detailed instruction. The time of the communion shall be immediately after that the priest has himself received the sacrament, without the varying of any rite or ceremony in the Mass, until other rites shall be provided. In other words, folks, watch out. But as heretofore, usually the priest has done with the sacrament of the body to prepare, bless, consecrate so much as will serve the people, so it shall continue after the same manner of form, that he shall bless and consecrate the biggest chalice or some fair and convenient cup or cups. They'd have to find vessels to do it with, some full of wine with some water in it. And that day he shall not drink it all up by himself, but rather take only a sup or draught, and let the rest upon the altar covered, and turn to them, and then he gives the cap, and then he turns and says he gives the intercession started, dearly beloved in Christ, as the catchword at the bottom says. So,
George, could I just interrupt there for a second?
Yes,
because
I finished with that. Yes, and I finished with
there's a point that needs to be. The reason it had to be an insertion was that the standard form, the standard text of the Mass in use in Western Europe from about 1200, though I know there's a guy in Cork who would say it's actually slightly later than that, actually didn't allow for any communion by the people. So that's why in 1548 they had to insert this. And it's interesting, at the moment in Roman Catholicism, there is a massive campaign for a so-called thing called the extraordinary rite.
yes.
And these people don't realize that the rite as used until 1969 actually was a text that had no communion rite for the faithful. So it wasn't even the case that they couldn't receive the cup, but the normal rite didn't even allow for the lay people to receive the bread. So this is why taking a defective rite, and it was defective, they had to make this insertion. They couldn't just doctor the rubrics. Sorry, I just thought.
Yes.
You know,
no, that's no, I didn't know that. That's interesting. But although they must presumably a practice of giving communion must have.
Yes, there was a practice, but they actually used an emergency rite which was for the sick.
Yes.
And they inserted it into the Mass. And then yeah, it's sort of like having made one mistake, they had to patch another mistake onto it. And then this has to be seen as a third patch.
Yes.
Or a second patch.
Yes. But although, yes, to answer your question, I mean, they will have quite a lot of people, so they will suddenly have received the cup, and they will probably have heard English spoken to them in the Mass for the first time. So it's so that is all it. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm finished with that little slide. Right. Okay. Right. So that anyway is how just to sum up, that is how they that is the basic answer to your question, how they actually encountered it for the first time. But it was established very quickly because, again, some of this instruction was repeated when the Book of Common Prayer was published the following year, but never in the same detail in 1552 or any of the subsequent versions. So presumably it wasn't needed.
Yes, that's the classic rubrical point, that if you don't find instructions how to do something, it's because everyone knows how it's done. Yes. So it must have actually taken off quite quickly.
Yes.
The interesting thing, of course, is that this wasn't just a liturgical detail. It was part of the larger agenda of the Reformers.
Yes. Oh, yes. 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 Very much so.
Jan Hus had made the point that because the gospel has the command, "Take ye and eat," the church had seen that as something which it had to fulfill. But he pointed out that there was another command, "Take ye and drink." And he said, well, if the first command has obligation, the second command has obligation. So the drinking of the cup is part of this larger agenda of loyalty to Scripture.
Yes, yes. Well, I think yes, and that certainly was the point that was, of course, the point that was made. This is what Scripture warrants.
The curious thing is, of course, that in that rubric we've just read, it's used the phrase and on the one hand, they use the word chalice. You will take the largest chalice, or else you will take a cup.
Yes.
So they're aware. You can see there an awareness of the tension between the Greek text on the one hand, which has copa, and the Latin text, which has calix.
Yes.
And that also represents their attempt to get back to the earliest practice.
Yes, although I think that, frankly, I suspect that a certain amount of that was there, but I think that there was probably as well an element of pragmatism. The question of how do you actually do this when the actual Eucharistic vessels did not make provision for it. They suddenly had to give communion.
All right.
They suddenly had to give
You
communion.
think I'm giving them extra marks for Greek that they don't deserve?
I have a feeling there. I don't know that. I think you may be being, frankly, Tom. I'm afraid. I think you may be being a shade over subtle there.
Okay. All right. Thank you, George. I will. Well, having then got into the practice, there was then actually a need to make a practical evolution. And I saw there some pictures of the Catholic practice had moved from a large cup. For instance, there's been various speculations as to how many bottles of wine could fit into the cup that the emperor Justinian is carrying in the mosaics in Ravenna. And it certainly would be more than 2 bottles. But if you go into the National Museum in Dublin, in Kildare Street, there are 2 cups there, one called the Derryn of Lan Chalice.
I know.
And the interesting thing is that both of them take virtually the same amount of wine, and they take 1.5 liters worth, which is 2 bottles. And interestingly, is an exact amount, early medieval measure. By the time of the Reformation, Catholic clergy had come down to using what was effectively the same amount of wine you would get in an ordinary stem glass. So they were probably putting about the same amount of wine into their cup that you would put into a modern sherry glass.
Yes.
Then, so once the Reformation had taken place, there actually had to be an evolution in the shape of the cups that were used.
Yes, well, that is, yes, and that is, of course, if I come in, yes, and of course, that is the thing that Anglicanism, that they developed the sort of the classic Anglican artifacts, which sort of took their shape over the next century or so, and in fact Dublin became quite a centre for making them. But so if I could possibly have my second slide, please, which I will, which actually looks at this. Yes, this is. Yes, this is, in fact, just to explain, and some of you may well recognize this picture, it is the communion plate of Cashel Cathedral. It is an illustration taken from probably one of those interesting books, remarkable books on Church of Ireland theology, F.R. Bolton's The Caroline Tradition of the Church of Ireland. And it's so here are the sort of the classic Anglican, what became the sort of classic Anglican artifacts, familiar and remembered by some of us, indeed, with great affection from the days of from days at Trinity College Chapel, where I now shudder to think at how we students probably manhandled these things, but we were very much using using similar flagons to these, but there are on the outside the flagons in which the wine was stored, and then in the middle, there are, in fact, there are from two sets here, and then in the middle there are what replaced the sort of the chalice, and in fact, to come back to your point, Tom, with the Latin and the Greek, and that they were in fact more commonly known as communion cups. The long chalices with, and incidentally with, as well, the sort of the distinctly convenience feature that if you see the tops of them, which are actually the patterns, which as you can see can be taken off, and the sort of the tops becomes the base to be set so that they can be set down on and used for and used as the patterns for bread. So I mean they are in fact they are the standard objects which generations of us will have been familiar with from as a standard.
George, can I ask you this isn't intended to be a nerdish question. It's intended, you'll see why it's a real. Do you happen to know what volume of liquid those cups hold?
No. I'm afraid. I'm sorry, Tom, but I don't.
Don't worry. I have driven sacristans and museum curators crazy over the years by asking them to get the volume. When I asked them for the volume of the Ardagh Chalice, I was just told by the museum, go off and figure it out with pi r squared. And I got a lovely one back. I said, no, it's pi r cubed. So the reason I ask is this. I have here a half-pint glass and it contains water. And it's ideal for sipping a liquid like water or what it was designed for, which was beer. I have beside me here a liqueur glass, a sherry glass, and you can see immediately that it's designed for only taking tiny sips.
Yes.
Because the amount of liquid that you take in with any action is a function of the diameter of this. So that's a real sip. That's a larger sip. Here is a contemporary individual chalice, and you can see you take about the same amount of liquid in as you do with this half-pint glass. You take a small mouthful, about the mouth, but if you go to a large cup like this,
yes,
and this, by the way, takes half the volume of the Ardagh Chalice.
yes.
Because it's so broad, you actually take a really large mouthful. And of course, depending on the amount of liquid you consume in any mouthful, it depends on whether it's a satisfying human experience or whether it's just a token experience. And I'm always intrigued in that the sort of culture that it's tokenized, it's just barely sipping, it's just barely some liquid that touches your mouth, touches your lips, is facilitated by vessels like this or this. Whereas if you have this cup, which was manufactured only a few years ago, you actually really realize you're drinking something, and you can realize that this is very much an individual's glass, but this is either the glass of a drunkard, or it's a community's glass, or it's a community's cup. And it's interesting that by the new shape they had to have to contain the volume, they were actually creating a new level of real liturgical experience. And I'm always amazed at how this is something that it's so obvious to us when we're going, if we go, you know, if you go into a pub, you expect to get wine out of a wine glass, beer out of a beer glass, and a liqueur out of a liqueur glass, because you react to these liquids differently. And yet these cups would have actually changed the experience of the communicants, and it would have immediately impressed itself on them in a way that using a cup like this would not.
Yes, yes, that's yes, yes, yes. That's certainly true. I'm not actually, yes, I'm just trying to think. I'm not really aware of all that much discussion on that particular point. But but I suppose the interesting thing is that it did become established so soon that they felt that, for instance, I just look here, that the priest shall receive communion in both kinds. This is from the first prayer book, 1549, himself, and shall deliver to other ministers. Then he shall present and to the people, and the minister give to everyone to drink once and no more.
Ah,
So,
interesting. How
yeah.
interesting.
But so that's quite, yes, that is interesting. But then by 1552, the second and even the more reformed prayer book, they just don't. It says it doesn't actually say anything like that sort of detail.
Can we just leave the technicalities of drinking aside for a second, because communion in both kinds then becomes one of the markers of Anglican identity in the 39 Articles.
It does, yes, it does indeed. Article 30 refers to, yes, Article 30 says briefly, yes, Article 30 says that the cup, the cup of the Lord is not, yes, the cup of the Lord. It is not to be denied to the lay people. So, but for both the I'm sorry.
While you're getting your breath back, I'll read it, Article 30.
Well, I'm trying to read Article 30. No, I'm trying. Yes, I've just got it. I've got it here. Yes. What is? If you've got it more easily, you can read.
Okay, I have it here. The cup of the Lord is not to be denied to the lay people, for both the parts of the Lord's Supper, by Christ's ordinance and commandment, ought to be administered to all Christian men alike.
Yes, yes, and yes, as that's true, and another, and I think one can link with that. The article that tends to be rather overlooked is Article 35 on the Homilies, which is basically the homilies, which tend to be these books of sermons that were specially prepared on the understanding that the most clergy could not deliver a proper sermon, but they were a sort of working, they're worth looking at because they're a sort of working out of the 39 articles. And homily 15 was on the proper reception of the Lord's body and blood. And I've taken a quick look at it. And while the point about its receiving both kinds isn't really discussed very much, the main interest is on whether receiving worthily or not, but it certainly is stressed that both are to be received.
The curious thing is that that phrase, by the Lord's ordinance and commandment.
Yes.
And it's very clear that the reason for doing this is because it's seen as loyalty to the will of Jesus.
Yes.
And I know you think that I tend to find I take your point that I might be over subtle, but I see a direct echo of Jan Hus in that phrase.
Well, yes. I mean, I have actually looked into this, and I may say I was even thinking when you're saying that in Western Europe people would not have that at all. But of course, the exception to that was of course in certain provinces of Central Europe, where in fact they did go on receiving communion in both sides after Hus. And there was, in fact, of course, one of the Hussite communions formed as a result was, in fact, called the Utrechtvists, or the receivers in both kinds. The thing about Hus was that he himself sort of slightly, it went under the surface a bit, and then, of course, emerged in about 1519 with Martin Luther, when he was, in fact, accused of being a Hussite. Mm. And this actually made him go off, and he looked at it and said, goodness, Hus, and he more or less said Hus was right. And it was after that it became he brought it into his sermons and his writings, and it caught on with people. I think there's nothing that gets people excited about a thing like feeling this is something that somebody else has and we should have by right. I suspect as many how it happened first of all with Hus, and then happened with the German Reformation, and then it became established, and so that it slipped in maybe to England relatively straightforwardly.
On the Catholic side, the trail becomes even more complex, because by 1519. it had become widely expected. It had become almost a common opinion that Huss had said nothing that was doctrinally suspect, and so theologians were actually playing Huss down.
Mm.
And it's only when it became suddenly a stick to beat Luther that the horror of Huss suddenly revives. And there's a very strange line in the Council of Trent, where the Council of Trent, discussing this issue, says, well, this is not what our practice is. But there's nothing actually wrong with utraquism, the position of Huss. You must have it sub utraque species, in both the kinds.
Yes.
And it actually leaves the whole thing wide open. But what then happens is it becomes, the identifier for Lutherans becomes the cup.
Yes.
And they identify with Huss. The Romans want to be very different to Luther. And so they don't take up the fact that Trent realizes, oops, this may be just an error. They get around it by saying, this could be just a variation in practice. But because Luther adopts Huss, the RCs attack Luther, the RCs attack Huss, and now it becomes an absolute chasm between the churches. It's amazing how, to my mind, the needs of fighting can blind us to theological obvious facts.
Yes, and I think it's the sort of, people need identifiers, signifiers of what they are and who they are.
Mm.
And I think that, so, and they will not necessarily care very much about what it actually is. But one of the things that is actually quite interesting, as you look at sort of the Reformation, I think, is how much things like social factors matter. That sort of, for instance, that Calvin also believed in communion in both kinds, but that it was almost like a sort of come in as a sort of mark of, for the people laity receiving it, was almost a mark of these are being good Christian citizens. So it's interesting the way in which sort of social factors become intertwined.
Well, if you want to talk about how, this phrase, my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Yes.
And, if you do it and I want to be your enemy, I'll do the exact opposite.
Yes.
There's a very interesting, the 39 Articles, I suspect, has had a massive influence on Catholicism in parts of the world in the last 60 years. Because I first held a chair in a place called the University of Wales, Lampeter, and I held the chair that had once been held by a very famous Anglican theologian of the 19th century, Edward Harold Brown. And I don't know whether you recognize that volume, but for the best part of 100 years, every Anglican ordinand probably bought a copy, though I suspect they didn't read it in great detail, because this copy was presented back to Lampeter by an old student in 1967. It was then withdrawn from the library and I bought it for the princely sum of £2.50.
Yes.
But this learned cleric, I know he was learned because he ended up as a canon and a D.Litt honoris causa of the University of Wales. he had never cut a lot of the pages.
Well, yes. I mean, to answer that question, I would certainly have tried to borrow a copy of that. If I had, well, it's interesting. I had not personally come across Brown. I accept your view of its canonical state.
Oh, look up his article in the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church. He still merits an article. Edward Harold Brown. But the interesting thing about this is, it was written as a reply to the tracts for the Times, and hovering underneath every page of this. And by the way, you know, Edward Harold Brown was a first-rate scholar. Like, this is the best 19th century scholarship on the Eucharist that you could produce in the 1850s or 60s. And so today we might giggle at it, but it was cutting edge stuff when it was written. He has Newman's Tract 90, where Newman attempts to interpret the tracts as Catholic, and Brown sets out to show they are thoroughly Protestant. The curious thing is that Brown's work became, for a lot of Catholics, the key to what Anglicans believed. And so when the reforms of the Second Vatican Council within the Roman Catholic Church took place in the early 1960s, they realized that one of the things they had to do was they had to think through the whole question of reintroducing the cup against enormous opposition. And so the opposition was, well, if you really think it's a good idea, and if you do suitable things, all the bishops in an area, you can do it. The curious thing is, it only happened in those countries where there was a real Anglican church. So for instance, it happened in England, but hardly at all in Scotland. It didn't happen in Ireland because the Catholic Church there didn't think too much about the Anglicans, even though they might have had a church just down the road.
Yeah, I think some of us maybe do have an Anglican. We do have a real Anglican church in Ireland.
Yes, I know, but but so for instance, you have the situation that the cup is found in Catholic parishes in England, not in Scotland or Ireland. It's unknown in France or Germany or Spain or Italy, but it is known in Switzerland, where they're very conscious that the Zwinglians are just there right beside them. So there's a curious effect that Brown, by pointing out it was a major defect in Catholicism, may have actually helped Catholic reform in the 1960s. And of course, still today, there's the curious thing is the cup has now almost become a token of whether you accept Vatican II or whether you're sort of part of this sort of Trumpian fundamentalism that imagines, you can go back in history,
Yes, just from the point of view of Anglicans, what happens, just if I can throw a question back at you, what happens in the US, in the United States, or places like Australia or New Zealand?
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, because in parishes that have a predominantly Irish or Italian background, it's not known. But if they have an Anglo-Saxon or German background, it is known, because in Australia, put bluntly, wherever the British Empire went, with the exception of Ireland, the cup is now part of Catholic practice. So it's part of, and interestingly, in New Zealand, it's normal, except in the parishes which have now been taken over by Filipinos. And if there's Filipino priests, they don't see any need for it. They think, no, only the priest.
Yes.
In In Australia, it's normal, but if they get priests in from India, they don't see the need for it. So, and of course, within our Roman Catholicism, there is a liturgical dominance of the presbyter that is unknown in the to Anglicans.
It's also very interesting. It's very interesting that you're almost saying that the 39 Articles and Brown got a status in Catholicism that they did not quite have in Anglicanism. Because my own impression of years of a member of my years as a member of the Church of Ireland General Synod, well, the 39 Articles are basically there as a big stick. You will occasionally be told that a particular faction will tell you which article you may be breaking at doing something, but that is, and there are of course sort of Anglican again in the with the sort of Brown's background, that there were all the mental gymnastics done in Oxford in the 1840s.
Oh yeah.
We accept the 39 Articles as they were originally accepted at Oxford University.
Oh yes. It's well, of course. The German New Testament scholar Gerhard Ebeling made a point. I actually had to dig out the quotation for an article I was writing for Bridget earlier this week. He said, "You can only say something twice when you change its meaning." Which, yeah, it's very curious. There seemed to be wherever Anglicanism was a large community just down the road that you couldn't avoid thinking about it, the 39 Articles had a very beneficial effect on liturgical reform in the 1970s for Catholicism. But wherever they weren't seen, they couldn't even see the problem.
Yes.
A couple of years ago at Easter, I was in a small Bavarian town, and I was just chatting to the local priest, and he said he was terrified on Holy Thursday evening. He was going to introduce for the first time, this dreadful business called intinction, of dipping and all that. And I said, it's awful. I said, it's not only misses the point, it's as bad as orthodox with spoons and playing with you're concentrating on it as if it's a commodity. It's the act of drinking the same cup that's the crucial thing. And I really scared him by pointing out that in the early church, they didn't worry whether it was wine or water. It was the common cup. Can you drink the cup of which I will drink? And but this is not last year. It was 2016. I was in this church only a few miles outside Munich, and for Easter. And for him, this was a major thing. And I finally, in the end, said to him, "Look, don't do it. If you're going to do this dipping business, you're just messing, because it's." But he was so scared about this. Whereas anywhere in the English-speaking world, even where they don't do it, they would have seen it done. And I think that has to be the impact of Brown.
Yes, well, it's interesting with Article 30 about that. Yes, that when I was looking for this, looked into what I think is a very good short introduction to the 39 Articles by Oliver O'Donovan's A Conversation with Tudor England.
Yeah.
I was actually looking for my copy just before at the start.
I can tell you, George, don't, because I've just got a message saying that Bridget is desperate to intervene.
Right, okay.
Well, I'm not desperate in the sense that I'm hugely enjoying this debate, and I think in principle we could let you go on all night, but I know we have a curfew on us of 8 o'clock, so I just wondered whether at this stage any members of the audience might have questions or reflections that they wanted to introduce.
Oh. Can I just thank, is it Major Burrows or is it Madge Burrows? I don't know whether. As someone who meets those large Cathedral chalices often, I reckon close on a litre. Thank you very much. That's useful. I think. And then Elizabeth has said, Elizabeth Young, in Australia, some dioceses, it was very common. And then she makes the instrument, for instance, in South Australian with German and English background. And that would fit because you know, I keep an eye for these things as I travel around.
Yeah.
Bridget, while you scan the, oh, I see Timothy says a comment. I'll leave that there.
Yes. Yes, well, Father Timothy, would you like to take us further into the intention question?
I wonder whether it might come up next week when we look at this in our conversation, but I was very interested in Tom's very vociferous antagonism towards intention, but which has a venerable history in the liturgy of St. James from the 4th century.
Oh yes, it has. It goes back to the blunder was first made by Gregory of Nyssa, and it was a blunder. He's the first man to use the word elementa, elementoi. He uses this because he thinks of the Eucharist in terms of elements. He doesn't think of it in terms of eating and drinking. So he moves from the action to the object. And of course, if it's the object, then of course you immediately can go in and start talking about substances. So uzii, and you can then go down that particular road. And of course, that not only is the road that famously becomes the scholastic standard, whether it's the Greek scholastic standard a la Damascene, or the Roman Catholic scholastic standard a la Gratian, and you know, both reproduced in manuals on the east and the west down to today. But the focus there is on what you're getting, and you keep asking the question, what? And of course, the problem with that is that it, number one, doesn't deal with all the interest in our early sources Nyssa is on the form, not the matter. So for instance, it's the sharing of the loaf, the klasmata. You actually have a part of the loaf. Whether that loaf is then interpreted as the body of Christ, or whether the loaf is the regathered Israel, or whatever, but you have a share. So the crucial question then is not what you're eating, but who you are eating with. And if I am sharing a loaf with you, I am actually establishing a physical unity with you. Now, again, all our references are not to the wine or any of the you can then play the substance game, but it's to the cup. So he doesn't say you are, like, it's interesting, Paul will talk about there is one loaf, but he doesn't say we are all one bunch of grapes or we are all one glass of wine. He says we are all, because we are sharers in one cup. So it's the actual activity of sharing one cup. Now, if you use the principle of discontinuity, the problem with sharing a loaf in the Greco-Roman world is that you have to share a loaf with both the clean and the unclean. There's no problem for the clean to share with the unclean, but the problem is when the clean has to share from the unclean. So for instance, if I believe you're unclean, for instance, a woman could be ritually unclean, will you hand me the loaf? Will you share the loaf with me? To share a loaf, that shares in the uncleanness. And so you then have to go in and look at the whole purity and impurity discourses that we find in the Gospels. But equally, when you go to the sharing in the cup, the cup presupposes equality. Are you prepared to share? It's one thing for me to share with my slave, you know, hey slave, you're going to be equal to me today, in the same way that in the army the officers serve the men on Christmas Day. But what if the slave says, hey master, you're equal to me? That's a very different problem. And so the whole thing is, it's actually breaking the cultural, there's a very strict cultural rule on sharing a cup. And in fact, it's almost never broken. For instance, if I were in a pub, I might give you, you might say to me, let me have a sip of that to see, will I have another, I'm sure you've done it, what's that pint like? And you say, oh yeah, this is the new bitter. And you might say, I'll take a sip out of it, but we don't share cups. But in the Eucharist, we actually share cups, and all the ancient chalices are variants on that rather than variants on that. And we have, Alistair McGowan gathered all the evidence in his book, Ascetic Eucharist, a few years ago, which is well worth laying your hands on, because he for instance, the earliest reference we have directly to wine in the cup is from the end of the 2nd century, where it says, please do try to use wine because it's fitting to celebrate. In other words, don't be ascetical using water. But the significance is the actual willingness. It's answering actually the question posed in the Gospel. Are you willing to drink the cup? Because drinking the cup is seen in terms of commitment to discipleship. It's commitment indeed to martyrdom in Tertullian. And but once you start thinking in terms of you've got to get something, then of course intinction becomes no problem, because it's just the actual cup just becomes a vessel. And that's interestingly why these individual vessels, the little sort of tiny thimbles that are used in some American churches, they're as destructive of the experience of the Eucharist as the pre-cut rondels that the wafer rondels that the Roman Catholic Church uses. The individual vessels destroy the unity of the cup in the same way that a pre-cut 1-inch diameter wafer, which is the ultimate piece of fast food, destroys the reality that we break and have shares in the one loaf.
But surely we're still sharing from the one cup when looking at an Orthodox chalice or a Catholic chalice. At least in the traditional masses, the principle is that there's still one chalice that's being consecrated and one source from which the Holy Blood is being...
In the Roman Catholic Church, the tradition has been since the 9th century for only the principal celebrant alone to drink from his cup. So he didn't even share it with the deacon and subdeacon, even if they ranked as priests. So for instance, I as a child remember Christmas Mass, Christmas Midnight Mass, one of the few times that the curates would be told to dress up as deacon and subdeacon, and accompany the parish priest. The parish priest alone received the cup. So you see, there's a deep human resentment to the idea of sharing a cup. Like if I said to you, let's have a cup of coffee, you're drinking a cup of coffee as we talk. You'd bring your cup, I'd bring my cup, and we'd have a pot of coffee between us. There's a deep human. There is a very strong element in the Eucharist that just as the one loaf breaks down the isolation of the pure and the impure, and you have to imagine the community in Corinth made up of Jewish men and Jewish women, culturally Jewish. They may not be followers of Jesus, but they see themselves as Jewish men and Jewish women. Are they expected to eat at the same table as one another? Jewish women did not eat outside their own household. Are they expected to eat at the same table as Gentiles, even if they are baptized? Are you prepared to eat with slaves? Are you prepared to eat with your clients? And then when it comes to actually sharing the cup, well, that really does, to mix the metaphors ghastly, that really does take the biscuit. But intinction and all of that presupposes that it's the stuff, it's an interest in the stuff of the Eucharist rather than the activity.
Tom, I'm going to leap in now and say that we've run out of time, and I must apologize to Elizabeth Young, whose question on whether we are likely to go back to the common cup after COVID is a strong possibility. Elizabeth?
Let us pray.
Right.
Let's pray that we'll go back to it. Number one, that we'll all get vaccinated. Number two, that we'll get vaccinated. Number one, we'll all be alive. Number two, we'll get vaccinated. Three, we'll get back to normal. And then we will do what the liturgy should do.
Yes.
Well, exactly. That's a great note too, and a great note of optimism too. But we have a further. This has been a most enjoyable session. Thank you, and extraordinarily instructive. And I'm particularly grateful to George for introducing the Order of Communion, about which I don't know nearly as much as I'd like to, but I shall be back to read it now. Next week, two of our presenters for next week are with us, Bishop Michael Burrows and Father Timothy Curtis. So thank you very much for tuning in tonight, and please join us again next week. And remember, for those of you who belong to the Centre for Applied Theology, there is a discussion board if you want to follow any of this up. James, thank you so much for convening it.
Thank you for saying that. I just, I'll just, before I stop the recording, remind people that actually I've recorded Elizabeth's question. I'm going to post it on the forum and attribute it to her. If people want to continue this discussion, because there are still so many outstanding questions and some brilliant points that are worth dealing with further, go to the forum on the website and sign in, and they'll be able to continue that there. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it somehow informative, please be sure to click like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would also love it if you visited the Centre on the web at www.appliedtheology.org.uk and took out a membership. At £20 per year, your membership is one of the main means of support on which we depend to carry out our work. Finally, look for us on social media. We can be found on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Just do a search for the Centre for Applied Theology. We look forward to having you join us.